This podcast contains material of a violent and disturbing nature. It is not suited for all audiences.
Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of Horror Tales, a podcast in which you can sit back and listen to a scary story. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm the producer of Horror Tales. First of all, a big thank you for the kind reviews and messages you sent us. It was wonderful to hear from you and I'm very happy you're enjoying the podcast so far. We have reached thousands of listeners worldwide and it's a great pleasure for the authors and for myself to have you all on board. So a big thank you to anyone who's listening out there. As always, to support us, simply share the podcast with your friends and on social media. As you know, I have narrated all the stories so far, but due to time issues I can't continue to do so at the moment. Luckily, I was joined by very talented narrators and voice actors, which allows us to keep going as planned, and we might even be able to release a bit more often. But now to today's story, which was written by a duo, Christa, Carmen and David Emery, and is narrated by Kieran Davison. The musical score and sound design are as always produced by myself. It is called The Devil's Leash.
The righteous need not fear the devil. Goodwife Hathaway forced a smile at Isabel's words, but her face was pale, and her hands did not cease their trembling. "Thank you, Goody Anvil," she said. "I will pray for the courage to accept this sentiment as truth." At the conclusion of this exchange, their party dispersed. Goodman Hathaway took his wife's hand and led her toward the fork in the road, while Elizabeth and her husband, Nathaniel, prepared to accompany Isabel to her farm. The sun's meager rays had not dispelled the morning fog. It snaked around their ankles and infiltrated every nook of the town, so that the Hathaways soon appeared to be little more than wraiths fading from life. "The Reverend's tenants are not without logic," Nathaniel said, turning conversation once more to the apocalyptic sermon from whence they had just departed. The tip of his pipe glowed, like the eye of a cornered beast in the misty morning. Though Isabel resented the necessity of having a chaperone, she drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "How can you say that, Nathaniel?" Elizabeth asked. "Or rather, how can you say that with the voice that quells not, that betrays not your terror, as you must have terror to rival mine? Do you believe, as the Reverend proselytizes, that our toils and troubles in Marvell Head matter not? That we are fast approaching the end to life in our village as we know it?" "I too am frightened," Isabel said. "Who of us confronted with the Reverend's words would not be? But I would like to see the Reverend produce evidence for these oracular claims. The citizens of Marvell Head should demand proof before allowing ourselves to be thrown into delirium and disarray." The road vibrated with approaching hooves, and they quieted, skirting to one side as Master Young drew up beside them. "Good morning, Goodman Danforth. Good morning, ladies." Young tipped his hat. His horse, Mathilde, snorted at some far-off noise and tossed her head. "Good morning, Master Young. Where are you headed?" "If you'll excuse me, Goodman Danforth, so that I may address the Goodwife Anvil," He tugged at his reins to better face her. The morning is late. The Brown family awaits the arrival of Dr. Anvil, ma'am. If you please, are you privy to your husband's whereabouts? Irritation must have shown plainly on Isabel's face, for he altered his approach. My apologies, Isabel. As you've instructed the townsfolk before, surely you are not your husband's keeper. But Goodwife Brown is experiencing complications, far above the midwife's skill set. Goody Brown's needs are. Am I to take it Lucius did not attend the morning service? Nathaniel tried to interject, but Isabel cut him off. Had he been present for the sermon, he'd be with us now. Had he returned to town for any reason, I'd have divulged such knowledge without hesitation. I can assure you, you are the only traveller whose path we have crossed since leaving Reverend Jacob's domain. At the conclusion of this impassioned speech, the four of them turned to regard the white-slated steeple perched atop the ominous hill. The bell tower was hidden by the fog rolling in from the east, and the sleek white siding gleamed with condensation, like the underbelly of a cod pulled from the sea. I mean no disrespect, the town blacksmith said, but if you see your husband, ma'am, please let him know that he is needed at Goody Brown's bedside straight away. With that, he rode off, leaving them to ruminate on the doubt raised by his disquieting words. Elizabeth started, but faltered under her withering stare. They made it another mile when a child appeared through the mist, like a small ghostly ship on a surging sea. Heaven above! Nathaniel exclaimed, extending one arm to keep Elizabeth and Isabel back. It's the Fulton boy! Isabel regained her wits quickly, though the boy's vacant expression and blood-stained visage stole the breath from her lungs. She pushed Nathaniel's arms away, and free from his overbearing disposition, cast herself with looking the child in the eyes. Though she knelt before him, and the angle was right, those orbs were depthless. They told her nothing of what had befallen him, and neither did the child himself. Nathaniel leaned close. He needs the doctor! There was a pregnant pause, in which the matter of Isabel's husband's mysterious absence went unspoken. We'll carry on and hope Dr. Anvil is home. And if Lucius has not returned? Isabel asked. You two will stay with the boy until he has. I'll take the gelding and gather the men to ride for the Fulton farm, to see what has befallen that family of ne'er-do-wells. Do not judge, and you will not be judged, Elizabeth recited from Luke. Very well, wife. I'll keep my tongue. But mark my words, the Fultons will have brought this trouble onto themselves. Elizabeth was about to reply, when a tremendous crack sounded from the forest. The party froze, and the woods answered their silence with a silence of its own. Then it came to them, jaw muscles working around rows of jagged teeth. The sound of excess saliva pouring from an open maw to the forest floor. What is it? Elizabeth whispered. It was the sound of a beast, preparing to pursue its prey. The boy became animated, squirming and mewling like a cat. Before he could disentangle from Isabel's grasp, she swung him up and pressed him hard against her breast. Another snap of teeth, a guttural growl, and the unseen thing began to crash towards them. The treetops shook, branches snapped like matchsticks. Run! Isabel shouted and started forward with the boy. Nathaniel pulled Elizabeth hard, and Isabel heard her yelp. They ran along the road, and the thing in the mist pursued them, keeping pace in the trees. It snarled and snapped, and brought to mind the very demons that the Reverend had described that morning. Isabel shook her head to dispel the memory, losing her bonnet in the process. and searched within herself for the strength to hasten faster. She could see the edge of her farm, but the snarling had gained in volume and intensity, and the air around them had grown hot, the mist clinging to their skin like a living thing, as if the beast pulled its breath from the bowels of hell. They flew over dirt and stones, and crashed into the relative brightness of open land. Elizabeth caught her foot on a root and went tumbling. Nathaniel jerked and almost fell himself. Isabel was about to shout for Elizabeth to get up, when she realized the blessed sound of silence had returned. Minutes passed. After a time, a bird twilled in the trees. Another joined in, and Isabel's heartbeat slowed. Whatever had pursued them did so no longer. Isabel half expected Lucius to have returned home, but it was not so. The house was empty, preternaturally quiet, and when Nathaniel returned from the barn after saddling up old Arthur, he told Isabel what she already knew. "There is no sign. Lucius has been back since this morning," he said. "It will take me a quarter of an hour to gather Goodman Taylor and make it to the Fulton place." His face clouded over. "If Lucius is not here by the time we get back, we will go looking for him too." "Wait!" Isabel ran inside and rummaged through Lucius's belongings, until she found the prize she sought, then returned to the door and offered it to him. "Do not venture out unarmed. Take Lucius's wheel-lock pistol, kept loaded and dry." He took it, and his face softened. "You are a force to be reckoned with, Isabel. My wife is lucky to count you as a friend. I am lucky to count you as a friend. Whatever is happening in Marvell Head, I have no doubt we will rise above it, thanks to the resolve of righteous folk like you. Look after the boy, Isabel." He paused, staring hard into her eyes. "And my wife." Isabel circled the farmhouse, barring doors and shuttering windows, seeing only by candlelight and hearth fire. Though it was still early in the day, the dimness did little to ease Elizabeth's nerves. But her friend seemed to find distraction in the boy. He was cleaned and cared for, and dressed in one of Isabel's husband's good shirts. An attempt was made to scrub the blood from his clothes, but it did not bear out. They filled the hours with work and gentle singing, and whatever little conversation they could manage. All attempts to engage the boy were met with silence, and one with trembling so violent, Isabel feared for his health. Their inquiries ceased. It was dusk when Nathaniel returned, Lucius not far behind. Neither man would speak of the events at the farm. Indeed, they said almost nothing, except to measure the future of the Fulton boy. In the end, it was decided he would stay with Lucius and Isabel for a time. When Lucius had taken leave to return the geldings to the barn, Nathaniel approached Isabel in confidence. "It was strange indeed, Isabel. Lucius arrived at the Fulton farm only after Taylor and I had taken stock of the calamity. He never did make it to Goody Brown's bedside. We discovered on the ride back she did not survive. For all our inquiries, Lucius would only say that there was a matter more paramount than either the good wife's trials or the massacre on the farm." He paused, looking stricken. "I must get Elizabeth home. Perhaps you will have more luck extracting the truth from your husband." They parted with more than the usual number of blessings and well wishes. Dusk fell, and the night brought with it a deep foreboding. The boy was set to sleep, and Isabel watched over him for a time, certain that nightmares would assail him. His slumber was as deep as his silence. Returning to the master chamber, Isabel found Lucius in his chair, eyes fixed upon the hearth, a teacup held in one long-fingered hand. "Is that brandy?" she asked. "'Tis. You disapprove?" "I have seen men destroyed by drink, but I have never seen you drink at all." The faintest of smiles tugged at Lucius's mouth. "I will take only a single cup tonight, as medicine." "What did you find that wounded you so?" Lucius turned and stared at her, his face gaunt. "Telling you will do no good. Ignorance to the truth will leave me blind in the face of this crucible." "Very well, but I will hear no complaint of this, even if it haunts you thus. We found nothing good on that farm." He paused. When he spoke again, it was with less cheer than a eulogy. "We did not recover everyone, but those found came to brutal ends. If there were survivors, they either fled or were taken. Taylor believes it to be Indians, as no civil man would be so savage." "And do you believe as Goodman Taylor does?" Isabel asked, struggling to keep the ire from her voice. "That we should blame this on the usual scapegoats, those men and women of the plains we know so little about? Savagery and sin beat in the heart of every man. The war that lasted 30 endless years taught me that." He paused. "And think what you want about Reverend Jacobs, but he too is well acquainted of the wickedness of this world. You traveled oceans since that war, and still it plays before your eyes. Where were you prior to arriving at the Fulton farm?" He eyed her then, as if she were a snake he thought benign, only to perceive its rattle. "The Reverend required my services in a matter of utmost importance. This is all I am at liberty to say." Isabel nodded, as if that answer had satisfied her, rather than unleash 1,000 mysteries from the darkest reaches of her mind. Lucius swallowed the last of his drink and rose from his chair. "It's time for bed. No more talk about savages and sin." But savagery and sin were not done with Marvell Head. On Tuesday, word came that the Belting farm was attacked. There were no survivors. On Friday, the Hathaway farm suffered the same fate, and a grain merchant was found murdered by the side of the road. On Saturday, a meeting was called, and all villagers encouraged to attend. The boy had not spoken once over the course of the week, though Isabel talked to him often. He remained dressed in Lucius's clothing. She had exercised her skill with a needle and thread to make the garb less cumbersome. Isabel thought to retrieve his own clothing from the Fulton farm, but was loath to make this entreaty to Lucius. As the meeting time approached, and Isabel tended to the boy, Lucius produced the wheel-lock pistol she had loaned to Nathaniel, and secured it beneath his jacket. When Isabel declared it time to depart, Lucius only nodded distractedly, and she wondered what was going on behind his grey and distant eyes. Once more, the day bore a heavy sky. Fog clung to the trees, and conspired to keep the forest secrets from the eyes of the just. Yet the shadows birthed neither mad Indian nor gibbering beast. Lucius continued to act, as if his mind was elsewhere, even when they stepped into the heart of the village. A crowd had gathered around the entrance to the town hall, most of whom were men carrying flintlock pistols or muskets. The mayor's angry words echoed across the square. "This madness stems from the Indians. Only a race more beast than man would have committed such savagery. What coward says these atrocities should go unanswered?" Men were shouting their agreement when the chaos was truncated by a loud, cutting voice. "Would you condemn us to becoming savages ourselves, Mayor Hollis?" The crowd stilled. The voice had come from behind, and everyone knew to whom it belonged. "Perhaps we should adorn ourselves with feathers and caper as we slaughter." A ripple of motion moved through the men as they made room. Isabel saw him, then, the Reverend Jacobs. He was thinner than he had been at the sermon a week before, as if any bit of flesh unnecessary for survival had been burned away by famine and fanaticism. He strode through the ranks, his gaze unflagging. "The carnage wrought is beyond the most ferocious of savages. Had you instigated this meeting sooner, perhaps the good people of Marvell Head would not have been led so far astray." Mayor Hollis made a show of spitting into the dirt. "Does the good Reverend possess knowledge of these attacks he has not shared? If so, speak now." "What I possess is perspective." The Reverend's voice grated like a skiff hauled across rocks. "Surely it has not escaped you what families of Marvell Head were ravaged. Let us catalogue the violence. First, there was the Fultons, a family with a penchant for lying and thievery." Isabel felt the Fulton boy press closer to her side. "Next came the Beltings," he continued, "whose wealth was built on brigand money. After that, the Hathaways were cut down. Every man here, and woman too, knows of their daughter's disgrace. Which leaves us with our butchered merchant, a man so greedy he charged a drowning for water. "Brothers," he commanded, "face these deaths for what they are. Savages, you say? Indeed, as savage as us men deserve. The Lord has forsaken us. Apocalypse is at hand." There was a moment of silence following Reverend Jacob's accusations, before the quiet burst like a dam. Men yelled and gesticulated wildly. A musket was discharged into the sky. "We need to move," Isabel shouted. The crowd surged like a unified thing, a single creature with incalculable extremities. Lucius was no longer at Isabel's side. Before she could call out for him, there came the terrible growl of the beast, which had given chase a few days prior. An answering howl came from deeper in the woods, followed by another and another. Without warning, Goody Tabitha bolted from the square. "Foolish woman," someone cried. "She's heading straight for the source of that monstrous noise." They watched as Tabitha ran for the forest edge, and it was only when she called for her husband that they realized Goodman Stedman was missing. A howl was Tabitha's only reply. It was so close, she must have been deafened by it. The shadows came to life, taking the shape of a thing, both man and hound. Isabel saw it. Only an instant before it pulled Tabitha Stedman into the mist. Chaos erupted. Men formed groups. The mayor was edged out of these assemblages, his entreaties for order ignored. One voice could be heard above all others, and that was the Reverend Jacob's, preaching ruin should the citizens of Marvell Head not stand and fight. Isabel's heart leaped at the sight of a familiar face. She forced the Fulton boy's hand into Elizabeth's and gripped her dear friend's shoulders. "Watch over him," she implored, ignoring her roving look of disbelief. "I have to find Lucius." Isabel left before Elizabeth could protest, and ran for a fence encompassing the square. She hooked the toes of her shoes into a chink in the wood, giving herself the advantage of several feet. At first, Isabel saw only women and children hastening from the square, Elizabeth and the Fulton boy among them. She turned in time to see Lucius following the billowing sash of the Reverend Spanion. "The church," she whispered. They were heading up the long rise to the hilltop. Her mind raced. Isabel knew she'd have but one chance to follow, and none without the proper mount. She descended from her makeshift pulpit, reorienting herself and formulating a plan. Isabel flew on quiet feet to the nearby stable, where the blacksmith kept both mule and mare. She said a silent prayer and maneuvered through the darkened barn. The only light came through the slats between the wood sidings. Two noises reached her ears at once. One was the panicked whinny of the Young's bay mare. The other was the ripping sound of something tearing into flesh. Isabel crept past the stall from which these terrible noises came. She reached the mare and unclasped the stall door. Mathilde bobbed her head, but Isabel caught her bridle and held her steady. Mathilde must have sensed the precariousness of their situation, for she did not whinny again, and allowed herself to be led into the corridor. There was no way to mount her quietly, so Isabel opted for speed, swinging onto her back with a childhood grace that returned unbidden and urged her forward. They were almost past the dreaded stall when a floorboard creaked. Mathilde jittered forward, and Isabel saw what fed on the hair-littered floor. A demon, naked of both hair and hide, lifted its dog-like head and stared through lids of subcutaneous tissue into what seemed Isabel's very soul. Blood fell from the points of 100 teeth. It growled, guttural and malicious. "Yeah!" she yelled, and kicked the mare. Mathilde bolted toward the stable doors, hooves like thunder, pursued by the beast, as inevitably as lightning. A shadowed figure stopped from the trees and leveled a musket. Isabel wrenched Mathilde's mane. As the shot sounded, the demon screamed, but in agony or anger she knew not. Mathilde surged past the gunman, and Isabel recognized Master Young. She risked a glance behind and saw the demon bear down upon him. Young threw the gun aside and produced a blade, but the beast paid no heed, impaling itself on steel to reach the hapless blacksmith, where it snapped its jaws around his skull with a sickening crunch. The horror of it dazed Isabel. The village streaked past. Gunshots and howls and screams were muted. It was not until Mathilde had gone halfway up the hillside that Isabel pulled on her mane and clicked her tongue, and the faithful mare slowed. The summit was silent, but at the sight of fresh hoofprints in the dirt, Isabel's anger surged, the blood rushing in her ears, drowning out all else. She pointed Mathilde in the direction of the churned earth, and they began to follow the trail. The path became so rocky and narrow. It was all Isabel could do to convince Mathilde to go on. They emerged onto more forgiving terrain. And again, fresh hoof prints became discernible in the dirt. The journey was shorter than expected, and Isabel rounded a turn to find a natural alcove in the rock. A stallion was tethered to a thin tree, growing from the cliff face. Mathilde wicked, and Isabel's breath caught, sure they would be discovered. Though her hooves clicking against a stone was far more likely to betray their presence. When no alarm was raised, Isabel slid from her back and secured Mathilde beside the stallion. Isabel looked about impatiently, certain her husband and Jacob's had come this way. Determined that Lucius's secret business with the Reverend should remain secret no longer. She took stock of her surroundings. The alcove was as if some heathen god had struck the cliff face with a mighty chisel. Far below, the cliff gave way to forest, and above, Isabel could just make out the tip of a steeple. Whatever this niche's purpose, it was directly beneath the church. Impossibly, a muffled cry came from the back of the alcove. Before Isabel could convince herself that her ears were playing tricks on her, there came a second, louder cry. Isabel's rational mind cautioned her of the foolishness of her errand, but her feet carried her forward before her courage could be tested. She reached out to test the sturdiness of the wall, and her fingers found canvas for their troubles. The rough grey sailcloth was matched well to the rock, and hung in such a way as to conceal a narrow opening in the cliff. Lantern light emanated from within, as did a hellish stench unlike any she had ever been subjected to. Perhaps another woman would have balked. Perhaps another wife would have stayed in town with the women and cared for the children as best she could. Isabel did neither of these things. The need to know, to understand, burned like a brand upon her breast. She pushed aside the canvas sail and entered. The sconces did little to illuminate the passageway, but Isabel traversed it quickly, hearing voices up ahead, one of which she recognized, as well as she could anything in this world. Thinking she would catch Lucius at last, Isabel bore left at the end of the corridor without pause, head held erect, tongue poised, to express her displeasure at whatever task the Reverend had engaged him in. She found Lucius and the Reverend Jacob's, leaning over a slab, lit with lanterns hung from the cave ceiling. Chained to a makeshift surgeon's table was one of the hellish beasts, bound with rope through loops of iron, its head held down by a thick leather strap. "You caught one!" Isabel was near certain of what she was seeing, but naivety would serve her purpose far better than blatant accusation would. Both men spun as if under siege, stopping when they saw her at the dungeon entrance. Isabel held one hand to her mouth in an attempt to ward off the stink of iron and rot that saturated the room. The Reverend greeted her with a predatory smile. "Isabel," he said with warmth she knew was false. "So kind of you to join us. Pray tell, have you come alone?" She looked to Lucius, trying to gauge the extent of his involvement, but he would not meet her eye. Isabel refocused her attention on the Reverend's fiery gaze. "There is no one here," but I. Your presence is unfortunate, but will not doom our work. Before Isabel could issue a reply, the demon moaned, long and low. It was a pathetic, sorrowful noise, and she turned to regard the wretched thing. Like the monster that chased her from the barn, it had 100 sharp teeth, sprouting from a distended muzzle. There was no hair to speak of, and what could be seen of its face was red, swollen flesh. The only aspect of the beast which did not inspire terror was its eyes. They were agonized, terrified, strangely human, and familiar. Goodwife Hathaway? Isabel whispered in shock. The monster moaned again, a noise too human for the demonic frame. Isabel turned on the two men. This is the devil's work. Reverend Jacob's smile fell away. Lucius, please take hold of your wife before she is reduced to fits so typical of the female kind. And do pass me the drill. I wish to complete this task before any further disturbances present themselves. For his part, Lucius handed the wicked implement to the Reverend. Would that you had not come here, Isabel, he said, stepping toward her with a grim expression. His hand darted out, faster than her eye could track, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her deeper into the hellish cave. Reverend Jacobs placed the point of the drill against Goodwife Hathaway's brow, and steel burrowed into skin. This close, Isabel could see other wounds, other drill marks, already perpetrated against her. As the drill bit into bone, she moaned again, but somehow did not thrash or scream. Lucius, what is this? What have you done? It was the Reverend who answered. Our work here is in service to the Lord. You do not believe that. You couldn't. Look upon your handiwork. Look at what you've turned her into. Do not deny your husband his fair part, Goodwife Anvil. Without his skill as a surgeon, we would not have been able to alter the physicality of the human body. Without his skill as a chemist, we would never have been able to manipulate a mirror image of the human brain. Reverend Jacobs set the drill and drew forth a long, thick needle. He slid it deep into the woman's head, paying no heed as her body convulsed. A demon, yes, he said, as if discussing mild weather. And once we've set enough loose on the world, the Good Shepherd will see the wickedness of man for what it is, and break the seals of heaven. As he spoke, the Reverend's hands continued in their work. He inserted the needle time and time again, and with each jab, Goodwife Hathaway grew more agitated. Her moans gave way to growls, and her clenched limbs began to shake with rage. The Lord has blessed us with another success, Lucius. We'll need to release this one straight away, if we're to make room on the table for your late wife. Despite the threat of his words, he did not look at Isabel when he spoke, going about his devilry, like any workman would, attaching a broad metal chain to the Goodwife's throat, and setting about loosening the other bonds. She fought and howled, her eyes tempestuous pools of bestial violence and pain. The wastefulness of it all, of the Reverend's poisonous beliefs and their corruption of her husband, of what they had done and what they had intended for her, spurred Isabel to unbridled wrath. "Lucius," she said, disgusted. "Why? You were a good man." He tightened his grip on her arm. "There are no good men," he said. "But this is an evil errand." He met Isabel's eyes then, and for a moment she saw the Lucius she had married. "It will be easier for you if you do not struggle." The Reverend broke into a madman's cackle. "Bring her!" he shouted. Lucius did not hesitate, dragging her toward the gore-soaked table. The demon that was once a friend and neighbor was chained to an iron ring set in the wall. She pulled against it, swiping and snapping at the Reverend. But he stood beyond her reach, resetting the bonds of the table for another occupant. "Lucius," Isabel said a final time. It was a calculated gesture meant to stall, or at least distract. She spun at him, this man she had foolishly loved, this man she had comforted in the darkest hours of the night. When the War of 30 Years' Time returned to him in macabre images, he saw as plainly as one sees the words on the page of a hymnal. Lucius shoved her forward, and she collided with the gruesome table. Isabel threw herself at him with renewed vigor. He raised a hand to strike her, and she lashed out, her fingers finding purchase on a solid object in his coat, her elbow cracking him across the skull. Lucius staggered, clutching one side of his face. Reverend Jacob emitted a howl to rival those of his creations, and lunged for her. He stopped when he saw what Isabel held between unflinching hands. It was Lucius's wheel-lock pistol, pulled from his jacket in the melee. In a fortuitous realization of latent intent, Isabel cocked the mechanism and pointed the barrel at the Reverend. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lucius recover and edge closer to where she stood. Reverend Jacobs forced a toothy smile. Chained to the wall, the demon screamed. "What will you do, Isabel?" the Reverend asked. "There are 2 men here, and only 1 bullet." "Strange that the Reverend would overlook the presence of thy God," Isabel said, "even in the isolation of this hellish cave." "God has forsaken Marvell Head," the Reverend said. "Only the devil is with you now." "The righteous need not fear the devil," she said without falter, and added a silent prayer. Her prayer was not for forgiveness or mercy, but for her aim to be true. Isabel sighted for the demon's chain and fired.
Thank you for listening to Horror Tales. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm a composer and sound designer. If you need custom music or sound design for your own project, please get in touch via the website www.horrortalespodcast.com. That is horrortalespodcast.com. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at horrortalespod. A huge thank you to Christa, Carmen and David Emery for contributing the story, The Devil's Leash. You can learn more about Christa Carmen on her website at www.christacarmen.com. Christa Carmen recently released her debut collection called Something Borrowed, Something Blood-Soaked. and with it she won the 2018 Indie Horror Book Award for Best Debut Collection. More information on David Emery and his writing can be found on his website at www.davidemeryauthor. That is David E-M-E-R-Y author.com. A huge thank you as well to the narrator of this episode, who is Kieran Davison. Kieran Davison also has his own YouTube channel, on which he narrates more scary stories. You can find him there at Distant Light Narrations. That is Distant Light Narrations on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let's meet again on the next episode of Horror Tales.